By the 1970s, westerns were supposed to be finished. Studios claimed the genre was dead, audiences had moved on, and the cowboy myth was crumbling under the weight of the times. But here's the twist. The 70s quietly gave us some of the boldest, strangest, and most unforgettable westerns ever made. So, what happens when Hollywood stops pretending and finally shows the West as raw, vulnerable, and human? Saddle up, because these films still pack a punch. The Hired Hand, 1971. Peter Fonda could have coasted on his Easy Rider fame, but instead, he made something hauntingly different. The Hired Hand isn't about gunfights or glory. It's about what happens after a drifter finally goes home. Fonda directed and starred as Harry Collins, a man who abandoned his wife and child years earlier, now returning to a world that no longer needs him. Instead of galloping into a triumphant reunion, he's met with quiet rejection. Vera Bloom, playing his wife, has built her own life, and she's not waiting for him to reclaim it. What makes the film stand out is its style. Fonda leaned into dreamlike cinematography, with hazy sunsets and lingering close-ups that feel closer to European art cinema than John Wayne grit. Critics at the time didn't know what to do with it. Too slow, too moody, too vulnerable, they said. But that's exactly why it works. The West isn't shown as a land of heroes. It's a graveyard of regrets. Over time, The Hired Hand has earned its cult following, with modern critics calling it one of the most daring revisionist westerns of its era. It's not flashy, but it's unforgettable. If you've ever wondered what happens when the cowboy myth runs headfirst into real human emotions, this is the film that delivers the answer. Bad Company, 1972. How do you make a western feel dangerous without a single outlaw showdown? Robert Benton's Bad Company answers that by stripping the genre to its bones. Instead of hardened gunslingers, we follow two draft-dodging boys, played by Jeff Bridges and Barry Brown, stumbling into a brutal world of outlaws, hunger, and betrayal. Forget about noble cowboys. These are kids, scared and starving, just trying not to die. The film's secret weapon is its countercultural edge. Made during the Vietnam War, Bad Company treats patriotism with suspicion and survival as the only code. Bridges, still early in his career, delivers a performance full of charm and rawness. But what shocks isn't his charisma, it's how quickly innocence rots away when the West refuses to play fair. Instead of finding adventure, the boys find themselves caught in a cycle of lying, stealing, and killing just to stay alive. Visually, Benton dials into realism. Dusty plains, grimy camps, and bleak landscapes turn the West into a wasteland, not a postcard. Some critics even accused the film of being anti-American at the time. Today, that honesty is what makes it timeless. Bad Company doesn't glorify the outlaw life. It exposes it as pathetic, desperate, and inevitable for anyone with nowhere left to go. It's a Western that hits harder now than it did then, because it proves survival stories are often uglier than the myths we cling to. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, 1973. Sam Peckinpah was no stranger to chaos, and with Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, he gave us one of the most melancholy westerns ever made, starring James Coburn as the weary lawman and Chris Christopherson as the reckless outlaw. The film turns their friendship into a funeral march for the Old West itself. This isn't about good versus evil. It's about loyalty crumbling, men aging, and the end of an era nobody wanted to admit was over. Even the soundtrack, anchored by Bob Dylan's haunting "Knockin' on Heaven's Door," feels like a eulogy. Ironically, the studio butchered the movie before release, chopping out critical scenes. What audiences got was a broken version that critics panned. Some theaters even refused to screen it, saying it was too bleak and too violent. But the restored cut tells a different story. Every gunfight is drawn out, bloody, and tragic. Every moment drips with regret. Coburn's Pat Garrett isn't a hero. He's a man worn down by compromise. Christopherson's Billy isn't a legend. He's a kid chasing freedom he'll never keep. Together, they symbolize the slow death of the West itself. For decades, the film has been re-evaluated as one of the boldest westerns of the 70s. What once seemed broken now feels deliberate, a reflection of a country tearing itself apart in the early 70s. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid isn't easy viewing, but if you want to see the cowboy myth dismantled with aching beauty, this is essential. The Ballad of Cable Hogue, 1970. Imagine Sam Peckinpah, the director known for blood-soaked chaos, suddenly turning around and giving us a gentle, funny, and surprisingly tender Western. That's The Ballad of Cable Hogue. It tells the story of a luckless prospector, played by Jason Robards, who stumbles upon a spring in the desert and decides to build a way station for travelers. Instead of bullets and bodies, we get a story about survival, ingenuity, and a man's small fight to carve out dignity in a brutal land. What makes it unforgettable is the tone. Peckinpah, usually the king of violence, fills this film with irony, humor, and melancholy. It's a Western that acknowledges progress, the coming of the automobile, the fading of old ways, and shows how fragile one man's dream can be when history refuses to stop moving. Robards plays Cable with grizzled charm, while Stella Stevens brings warmth and wit as the woman who refuses to be a background character. Critics didn't know what to do with it in 1970. Too soft, too strange, they said. But decades later, it's celebrated as one of Peckinpah's hidden gems. It proves he wasn't just about carnage, he could handle heart. The Ballad of Cable Hogue is the Western you don't expect. It doesn't scream or shoot its way into history. It quietly lingers, like the last sunset before the frontier disappears. If you think Westerns are only about guns and grit, this one will make you think again. McCabe and Mrs. Miller, 1971. Robert Altman was never interested in telling stories the Hollywood way, and McCabe and Mrs. Miller might be the greatest example of that. Forget the clean, heroic Westerns of the past. This one is a slow-burn tragedy wrapped in snow, fog, and Leonard Cohen ballads. Warren Beatty plays John McCabe, a gambler who builds a frontier town with big dreams but no real plan. Julie Christie steals the film as Mrs. Miller, a sharp and pragmatic woman who turns his chaos into profit. Together they create a thriving business, but the story is really about inevitability, the railroad, the corporations, the unstoppable march of progress that doesn't care who gets crushed along the way. Altman's style is what makes it legendary. Overlapping dialogue, muted colors, and long takes create a dreamlike world where every detail feels alive. The shootouts aren't clean, they're clumsy, snow-choked, and terrifyingly real. Critics at the time were divided. Too weird, too quiet, too anti-Hollywood. But over the years, McCabe and Mrs. Miller has risen to the top of the revisionist Western canon. This isn't about cowboys winning the day. It's about ordinary people trying to survive while history grinds them under. It's haunting. It's beautiful. And it might just be the most important Western of the 1970s. Watch it, and you'll never see the genre the same way again. The Culpeper Cattle Company, 1972. Most Westerns made cattle drives look noble. The Culpeper Cattle Company tears that illusion to pieces. Directed by Dick Richards, it follows a wide-eyed teenager named Ben, played by Gary Grimes, who joins a cattle drive dreaming of heroics. What he gets instead is mud, cruelty, and betrayal. This is not John Ford's sweeping West. It's dusty, brutal, and full of disillusion. What makes it hit hard is the visual style. Richards drained the film of color and gloss, giving it a washed-out look that feels more like a documentary than a Hollywood picture. Every frame screams grime and futility. The cattle drive isn't a grand adventure. It's a death march through broken dreams. Ben learns that survival isn't about bravery. It's about making compromises that corrode your soul. At the time, some audiences were shaken. Critics praised the realism, but small-town theaters dismissed it as nihilistic. People didn't want a West that reminded them of Vietnam and Watergate. They wanted myths, not honesty. But that honesty is why the film has aged so well. The Culpeper Cattle Company isn't a crowd pleaser. It's a gut-punch reminder that the frontier was just as full of broken promises as opportunity. For anyone tired of polished cowboy legends, this one is essential viewing. The Great Northfield, Minnesota Raid, 1972. Hollywood had been polishing the Jesse James myth for decades. Then Philip Kaufman showed up and stripped it bare with the great Northfield, Minnesota raid. Instead of noble outlaws, he gave us desperate men botching a robbery with chaos and humiliation. Robert Duvall plays Jesse James, but not as a folk hero. He's reckless, dangerous, and just another criminal scrambling to stay afloat. The film's highlight is the bank raid itself. Instead of a smooth operation, it's a disaster. Civilians fight back, shots ring out in panic, and the gang collapses into disarray. It's not glorious, it's humiliating. Kaufman leaned into absurdity, making the robbery feel more like a tragic farce than a ballad. For audiences raised on romantic outlaw tales, this was a slap in the face. Some theaters in the Midwest outright refused to show it, claiming it dishonored heritage. But that's what makes it powerful. By dragging a legend through the mud, it forces viewers to ask why we worship criminals in the first place. The great Northfield, Minnesota raid may not be as famous as other westerns of the decade, but its influence is huge. It was one of the first films to really pull outlaw myths apart and expose the messy truth underneath. In other words, it made Jesse James human, and that's scarier than any gunfight. Doc, 1971. We all know the story of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, or at least we think we do. But Doc, directed by Frank Perry, flips that legend on its head. Instead of heroic lawmen, we get flawed, bitter men just trying to hold on. Stacy Keach plays Doc Holliday as a sick gambler clinging to survival, while Harris Yulin's Wyatt Earp comes across as manipulative and self-serving. Even the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral becomes messy, brutal, and without winners. What makes Doc stand out is its refusal to glorify anyone. Kate Elder, played by Faye Dunaway, isn't pushed to the sidelines. She's a sharp, complicated woman whose presence anchors the story. Instead of watching heroes triumph, we watch ordinary broken people stumble into history by accident. At the time, this approach was considered almost offensive. Some theaters banned it, claiming it dishonored American legends. Critics were split too. Some praised its realism, while others called it cynical. But that cynicism feels closer to truth. Doc has aged into one of the most underrated revisionist westerns of the 70s. It strips away the Hollywood varnish and asks a blunt question. What if our heroes were never heroes at all? The answer is uncomfortable, but unforgettable. Valdez is coming. 1971. Burt Lancaster didn't just star in Valdez is Coming, he owned it. Playing Bob Valdez, a quiet Mexican-American constable wronged by a wealthy rancher, Lancaster delivers a performance that transforms a small revenge story into a powerful commentary on justice. The setup is deceptively simple. Valdez is forced into killing an innocent man during a standoff, manipulated by the rancher. When he demands compensation for the widow, he's humiliated, beaten, and tied to a cross as punishment. Instead of giving up, Valdez returns with quiet determination and a single demand: $200. It's not greed, it's justice. The brilliance of the film lies in its balance. On one hand, it delivers classic Western thrills, ambushes, shootouts, a lone man taking on a corrupt system. On the other, it digs into themes of prejudice, power, and dignity. Lancaster's restrained intensity makes every scene crackle with tension. Critics often call Valdez is Coming one of the most underappreciated westerns of the decade. It didn't get the fanfare of Wayne or Peckinpah films, but its mix of action and moral weight makes it unforgettable. It's the kind of film that sneaks up on you, not flashy, but powerful enough to linger long after the credits roll. Jeremiah Johnson, 1972. Robert Redford was at the height of his powers in the early 70s, and Jeremiah Johnson proved he could carry a film almost entirely on his own. Directed by Sidney Pollack, this survivalist western is less about shootouts and more about solitude. Redford plays a disillusioned man who retreats into the mountains only to find the wilderness just as cruel as civilization. What sets it apart is the raw authenticity. Shot on location in Utah, the landscapes are breathtaking: snow-choked peaks, endless forests, rivers raging with life. Redford actually lived rough during parts of filming, adding grit to his performance. The story unfolds slowly, showing how Johnson learns to hunt, build, and survive, only to be dragged into violent conflict with Crow warriors. The film became a cult hit, not because of action, but because of its mood. It's a meditation on survival, isolation, and the cost of carving out a life on your own. Unlike traditional westerns, it doesn't glorify independence. It questions it. Critics praised Redford's performance and Pollock's direction, though some audiences found it too slow. Today, it's hailed as one of the greatest mountain man films ever made and an essential 70s western. Jeremiah Johnson isn't about conquering the frontier. It's about realizing the frontier can conquer you. The Cowboys, 1972. John Wayne was already an icon by the 1970s, but the Cowboys showed him in a role that was darker and more vulnerable than audiences expected. Wayne plays rancher Will Anderson, who hires a group of schoolboys to help drive cattle after all the grown men head off for gold. It starts almost like a coming-of-age adventure, but quickly turns grim when the boys are forced to grow up at gunpoint. The real shock comes halfway through, when Wayne's character faces betrayal and leaves the kids to finish the drive on their own. For audiences raised on Duke's invincible cowboy roles, this was a gut punch. Instead of Wayne saving the day, it's the children who must harden into men to survive. Director Mark Rydell balanced, sweeping landscapes with intimate character moments, giving the film both scale and emotional weight. The performances from the young cast add authenticity. You believe their fear, their stubbornness, and their transformation. At the time, The Cowboys divided critics. Some praised its honesty, while others said it was too bleak for family audiences. Today, it's recognized as one of Wayne's most daring late-career choices. The Cowboys isn't just about cattle. It's about the painful, unavoidable leap from childhood into the brutal reality of the West. The Shootist, 1976. If The Cowboys was a shock, The Shootist was a farewell. John Wayne's final film, released in 1976, is as much about the actor as it is about his character. Wayne plays J.B. Brooks, an aging gunfighter dying of cancer who decides to go out on his own terms rather than fade quietly. It's not just a role, it mirrored Wayne's own failing health, making every scene feel eerily real. Directed by Don Siegel, the film is steeped in melancholy. Brooks rents a room from a widow, played by Lauren Bacall, and strikes up a bond with her son, played by Ron Howard. The quiet moments are the most powerful. Brooks reflecting on a life of violence, realizing legends don't last forever. The climax delivers exactly what fans expected. One last, explosive shootout. But it's stripped of glory. There's no triumph, only inevitability. Wayne, grizzled and frail, gives a performance that feels like both confession and goodbye. The Shootist received strong reviews, with many critics calling it the perfect end to Wayne's career. And it was. Not because it was flashy, but because it was honest. The Shootist isn't about victory. It's about knowing when your story is almost over and choosing how to end it. Ulzana's Raid, 1972. Few westerns dared to tackle frontier violence as unflinchingly as Ulzana's Raid. Directed by Robert Aldrich and starring Burt Lancaster as a seasoned scout, the film drops audiences into a brutal cat-and-mouse chase between the U.S. cavalry and an Apache raiding party. Unlike older westerns, Ulzana's Raid doesn't paint clear heroes or villains. The Apaches commit horrifying acts, but they're driven by survival and vengeance. The cavalry, meanwhile, is shown as inexperienced and naive, unable to comprehend the land they're fighting on. Lancaster's character understands both sides, making him the bridge between cultures, but also the most tragic figure. The violence in Ulzana's Raid shocked audiences in 1972. Critics accused it of being too graphic, while others saw it as a Vietnam allegory, exposing the futility of endless conflict. Aldrich refused to soften the brutality. Every ambush, every skirmish, feels chaotic and terrifying. Over time, the film has been recognized as one of the smartest, most unsettling westerns of the decade. It strips away romanticism and forces viewers to confront the cost of war, whether on the frontier or in modern times. Ulzana's raid is not comfortable viewing, but that's what makes it unforgettable. Heaven with a Gun, 1970. Glenn Ford wasn't ready to give up on the Western, and Heaven with a Gun gave him one last memorable outing. He plays Jim Killian, a former gunfighter who returns to a town plagued by cattlemen and sheepmen locked in violent rivalry. But instead of reaching for his gun, Killian tries to broker peace as a preacher determined to stop the bloodshed. What makes the film compelling is its tension. Killian is constantly pulled between his violent past and his desperate attempt to keep his gun holstered. The cattlemen see him as weak, the sheepmen doubt his intentions, and the town itself teeters on collapse. Ford's performance balances quiet authority with flashes of the gunslinger still lurking beneath the surface. Critics at the time dismissed it as old-fashioned, but that's unfair. Heaven with a Gun is one of those transitional westerns. It keeps one boot in classic storytelling while edging into revisionist territory. The message is clear. Violence is easy, restraint is hard, and redemption doesn't come cheap. It may not be as famous as McCabe and Mrs. Miller or Pat Garrett, but it's absolutely worth rediscovering. Ford's weary dignity carries the film, and the moral questions it raises feel surprisingly modern. Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, 1974. Technically more of a crime western hybrid, Sam Peckinpah's Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia bleeds with the same dusty DNA as his frontier classics. It follows Warren Oates as Benny, a washed-up piano player who sees one last chance at redemption when he accepts a bounty to deliver a fugitive's head. What unfolds is a surreal, bloody odyssey across Mexico that plays like a western pushed to its breaking point. Peckinpah shot the film with raw intensity, mixing violence, dark humor, and aching sadness. Benny isn't a hero. He's a man so desperate for purpose that he takes on a job no sane person would. Along the way, he's tested by betrayal, greed, and his own crumbling morality. At release, critics hated it. Too grim, too strange, too violent, they said. Audiences stayed away. But over the decades, it's been reclaimed as a cult classic. Peckinpah poured his own disillusionment into the story, and Warren Oates delivered a career-defining performance. Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia may not look like a traditional Western, but it carries the same themes: survival, betrayal, and the high price of chasing legends. If you want to see the genre's rough edges explode into something raw and unforgettable, this is the film. So there you have it. 15 westerns from the 1970s that prove the genre wasn't dead at all. It was evolving, bleeding, and breaking myths in ways Hollywood wasn't ready to admit. Some are gritty, some poetic, some flat-out shocking, but every one of them is worth your time. Which of these would you saddle up to watch first? Drop your pick in the comments, hit subscribe, and share this with someone who still thinks the West ended with John Wayne.